So my bio is in the handout, so I'm not going to talk about that too much, but I will mention that I lead the data science group for Fehr Peers. That's why I didn't actually do all those things I raised my hands for, but we as a collective with our clients have. And as I mentioned in my intro in this room, I've been working with StreetLight since the very beginning, and one of the things that I've appreciated most is the collaboration. What we can do now is fine, but what we want to do is what I always am striving for. So that puts a lot of pressure on these guys, but hopefully we have a good relationship, and it's all in the sake of our clients. I don't need this stuff. We're just trying to help our clients. So today what I'm going to talk about is a lot of detail about VMT, because in California it's really important. It's getting to the underlying information that every other metric is based on in a lot more detail. And then based on conversations we had and folks in the room, I just threw in a bunch of slides at the end about other things that we've been collaborating with StreetLight on that you maybe have seen at APA conferences, don't know the audience attendance on conferences. So I just wanted to highlight other things that we've been collaborating with. None of it is actually through the portal, because that's the kind of questions I ask. So I'm going to talk about VMT, and since we're leading up to lunch and we just now got some snacks, did we bite off more than we can chew? Usually I do, but luckily my relationship with StreetLight is that we work together as a team. We try not to mislead our clients too much, that we can actually deliver what we say, and sometimes actually deliver more than what we say. Under promise and over deliver is our motto, and that's why we appreciate our partnership with StreetLight. So I'll give a little bit of background first on why this was so complicated and why we can't do it through the portal, and then get into the overall. So really just the challenge, existing things that we have, and why we didn't use them. The new solution that we partnered with StreetLight to develop is still in beta, internal only. It might become a product in the future, don't know. So that's up to the R&D team to figure out if it's a product or not and how much they can charge. I'm not involved in that part. And then some conclusions on big picture takeaways. So for those of you not in California, we have very strict environmental regulations on everything. We have the most strict environmental regulations in the country, going through how to protect the environment to how to incentivize developers and municipalities to develop in a way that's sustainable in the definition of the state, which is minimize energy consumption, minimize dependency on autos. And over the past 40 or 50 years, we've been focusing on how cars behave. Well, cars don't behave, people do. So this legislation really looks at how can we meet multiple objectives with one criteria and make it easy to do so that you don't spend so much time developing projects just for environmental purposes and you actually do good projects. So it's trying to really streamline the environmental process to say if you meet these criteria, like an infill development, previous criteria based on intersection level of service, you'd have a deficiency and you have to override it. But do we really care in most cities how long cars sit? We really care how people travel and what options they have available to them with all the modes. So that's trying to meet multiple objectives with one criteria, which is very difficult. And then also balance the statewide goals of reducing emissions and also having clean air to breathe. So I don't go into all the legal stuff. I just pulled this out. The Office of Planning and Research was tasked with reading the legislation and determining what does that mean for actual day-to-day work. And so they came up with the guidelines should be used by agencies to set a threshold for environmental purposes, and the threshold should be sustainable for humans. That's what we care about. So what they determined is VMT, so vehicle miles of travel, is the metric that we should use because it gets into effect how long people are driving. That's their potential collision for safety issues. Also that they have alternative modes available to them. They don't necessarily need to take them. Long distance trips, maybe cars the most appropriate, but for short distance, they have options. And then the next question is, but not all VMT is created equal. Is it the VMT that's generated by the development itself and the people who are using it, or is it the people passing through on the roadway network? And since most of these projects are land use based and the incentive is to have infill development, they picked the land use VMT that's generated by the project. So then we get into this other complication in California is we have VMT as a word for multiple different criteria. We have it for air quality, which is the AQ, which is what you breathe when the car drives by. You have the greenhouse gas, which goes into the air and causes climate change. We have energy consumption, which is fuel or electricity to move. And then we have SB 743, which is focused on land use efficiency. So now it gets really complicated because one metric is going to be used for different purposes, and they also are not the same quantification method. So it gets really complicated in terms of what you're trying to accomplish and how you measure it. So what we tried to do is say this, we're confusing people, like we're confusing all of you. This can't be, we have to find a way that's easy, that there's a tool available that you can ideally do one metric that covers all the different values, so you don't have 15 different measures of the same criteria. So we looked at existing data. The VMT is not directly observed because even if you look at your odometer, not every car has to get their odometer read every year, depending on when your make and model of the year are. So that's not a good source. VMT estimates from counts are only a spot location. You don't know how they actually traveled. And then, highway performance management system that the DOTs and FHWA, it's an estimate. It's taking the counts and scaling it up. And then StreetLight has data, so that's good. We looked at travel models. Travel models have pros and cons. They usually stop at the boundary of their model area. They don't include recreational travel. There's a lot of downsides with them. And then sketch models just use regional or national averages, which are not appropriate to actually any real project. So we said, well, this is unfortunate. But big data and StreetLight maybe is a solution. So this was talked about before, the home and work location. So we said, this is great. We could look at the home and work location of trips and figure out where they're going. The unfortunate thing is that's not actually an OD. It's where the people who live and work who visited a site are, not necessarily where they traveled from. So we said, well, that's unfortunate. We also need it by resident and work and all these different combinations of, do they live in the region? Do they not live in the region? Do they work in the region and not work in the region? So we couldn't get it straight from the portal. So we looked at all these different considerations of, well, should we just go back to one of the existing tools? There's different defensibility. If most projects are going to get challenged. Are they sensitive to the types of things that we're going to look at in the future, like autonomous vehicles, the income of the people? Can you actually use them? Like, there's a lot of pros and cons of all these things. And we found that none of them are really good at what we want to try to do. So again, we said, well, let's go back to StreetLight and see if we can, there has to be some way to use their data to do something that we're not doing now. And again, not all VMTs created equal, but when we talked to StreetLight, what we couldn't do is say before and after this development is there, what's the project's effect on VMT, that if you add a store, you don't have to drive as far to the store. You can't do that until the project's developed, but this is the project development stage of the project. There's no after, so that doesn't work. But what we can get is the project generated VMT. So if the project exists, where do the trips go to and from, regardless of political boundary? The project doesn't exist, but what we can do is get regional averages for for home-based work, on average, in this type of built environment, how far do they have to travel to work? This office environment, how far do they on average have to travel? And luckily the legislation was based on less than regional average. So we said, great, we can calculate regional average now, and then we can calculate project specifics after. So we said, well, that's great. The metric is VMT. By all these different categories, StreetLight, can you do this? And they said, yeah, we can. It's not through the portal because it's a custom project, because we need to know, do they live in the region and not work in the region? Do they work in the region, not live in the region? Or do they live and work in the region? Also, there's visitors who travel in the area and they don't do any of those things. They're just having fun. Technically, we're working today, but we're considered visitors because we don't live or work here. Some of you maybe work in the region, but most of us are visitors. So we're excluded in this analysis. So we need to keep all the VMTs separate, but it's not just relative to the specific project, it's relative to the region. That's where the home and work location come in again. Do they not live in the region, but they work in the region? And then related to travel. So we came up with this diagram. We had lots of back and forth phone calls, in-person meetings to make sure that we understood what are we actually trying to do, because the quantification is really important for this complicated method. And then we did the first round of analysis. So we had 2 mega regions, Southern California and Northern California MPOs, and we looked at that. This is just the example from Northern California. I didn't want to just put too many numbers up here, but just the example of if we had used their activity-based model, they synthesize all the people, and they have a certain number of trips, and so on. So we said, okay, the StreetLight sample is small, but it's real observations, so that's really good. So what if we look at the trip lengths? It's a little bit on the low side. Why is that? So we started investigating, what types of trips are actually included. Do they include too many short distance trips that the models and surveys don't include? What is the demographics of the people traveling? Those types of things. And then we looked at a distribution. Actually, Laura made this. It's actually very collaborative. Some of the tables I made, some of the tables StreetLight made. This one's Laura or her staff made. And what didn't make sense to me, knowing the region, is why are only 60% of the trips that don't live or work in the region 30 miles? It seems like it should be a higher number, because once you leave the region, you have to travel really far to get to the next job or house. So they, StreetLight went back and looked at the results and said, you're right, we're inadvertently excluding trips that went too far, because we said, our region's so big, for analytical purposes, let's just cut it short. We said, oh, we don't want to cut it short, we want their full travel distance. And then when you reran it, the distances are much greater. So 80% of the trips that don't live or work in the region are greater than 30 miles, which makes a lot more sense to us, because when you leave the region, you have to travel that far. So it's this collaborative back and forth. It actually took quite a while because we're all so busy, and this was just a research exercise. Hopefully it turns into a product, because then we can start generating some revenue from it. But this was really just a back and forth collaboration. And then when we dug into the details a little bit more, these are all the questions I asked of, okay, but the regions outside of the Southern California and Northern California are lower income people. They might be not as tech savvy. Might that influence the trip distance? And no, because of all the stuff we talked about this morning, we investigated it together and said, there's no proof that lower income people or people who are less tech savvy travel less and are represented less. So we said, okay, good, it's representative, which is part of the defensibility. Maybe the trips that travel a really long way stop at a gas station or stop for coffee along the way, and their trips are broken up. Or you just lose their trip because you get their origin and not their destination. And that could be true. So we're going to still do research on how big of an impact that is, but the results seem reasonable. Also not disproportionately impacted. So that's an impact. We can figure out the details of how to fix it, but it's mostly fixed now. And then the home and work classifications are maybe not right, because home is technically daytime or nighttime location, and work is daytime location. But what about if you're a shift worker? And what we said is true, but the proportion of shift workers is not that great in this area, so not a big deal. Laura also made the comment that students, let me rephrase, university students might also be disproportionately showing up as work because they have the same routine daily. But we decided that university trips are so insignificant in terms of the overall travel, not going to worry about that. Actually, so that's the end of VMT, but we had really great discussions today about other things. So I'll come back to a summary of this process after, but I wanted to show some other, not through the portal, cool stuff that we worked on, because there's a lot of effort behind all this. So thanks to people not in the room and those of you in the room. This was about a year, only because of all the back and forth, and we're all so busy, and it's not generating revenue, so it goes to the side, but thanks for the 99% done on this one. The other thing we talked about was trucks. So passengers are important, but goods movement is also important. You can get the slides later to read all this, but basically there's laws enacted so that truckers can only drive a certain amount of distance before they are required to stop. And that is part of the reason why trucks might be parking illegally. So this research project was find out where are trucks parking, and are they parking illegally, and why are they doing that? So that you could do surveys, which is very labor intensive. The trucking industry also doesn't see the benefit of helping you do planning, because what are they getting out of it? You could use raw GPS data, but it's a lot of processing. And also, again, truckers don't like to give you that because they don't want, that's their competitive advantage of when they leave and which routes they take. You'd also look at the FHWA equation, which has nothing to do with local conditions at all. So we basically excluded most of those things. But we did say, again, StreetLight has some truck data. Maybe there's something here. So what we did is we collaborated and we said, where are trucks not moving over some criteria, 4 hours or something they're considered stopped. And then what we did is we worked in the back portal. StreetLight did their analysis and then shared with us the data through some kind of a portal that's not the standard one. Don't know how your data scientists did that, but thanks. So my staff were able to look at this and say, oh, I can see patterns of this, and I can download the data and put them on top of aerials and verify, is this illegal truck parking or not? Verifying if it is legal truck parking or not, that's a whole separate thing I won't get into, but maybe as an additional thing that you could bring into your portal is uploading data into your portal. So we looked at surveys from truckers, Google, where's the truck stops, where's the rest stops, and what we did is we identified where there was trucks parked that was not technically a designated truck parking area. And we got super lucky that there's actually Google Street View and aerials to show trucks there. So we went through 1/4 of California, it's I-5, but it's really important for goods movement, so there's a lot of trucks. And we've basically validated that, yes, this is a viable method to identify where trucks are parking. You can use other data sources to validate if they're parked legally or not. The part out of our research project was the duration that they were traveling, and was it longer than their allotted drive time? Or was it maybe they're waiting for the commodity to be ready to be delivered or picked up? That's out of our research project, but that's things that we could do in the future, which was, why is this happening and what to do about it? So that's a lot of the stuff that we've been working on. One thing that I haven't worked on with StreetLight data, but with their gig data I do want to use. I used a different data set for this, so I won't mention what it was. But the gig data is very helpful because there's more and more urban deliveries. Again, you can read the details on the slide later. But what we did is we developed a regression equation. The model estimate is based on household travel survey and household time use survey, which is a great resource for transportation planners. The American Time Use Survey, what do people do with their time? It's not only traveling. So we looked at how people shop, maybe online, and we developed a regression equation on the left to say where do people shop and where do they get their goods delivered. And on the right was the observed data of where deliveries are actually made. Close enough for this research purposes. So we said, great, that equation is valid. Now let's do a bunch of scenario planning. What if people shop online more than shop in the store and have it delivered? That's the top right. What if shopping online is so easy, you just go around buying everything and have it all delivered, so you actually shop more than online or in the store, which is the bottom left. And then what if you get delivered to your workplace instead of your home? That's the bottom right. So this really is just hotspot analysis of what might you need to do under various future uncertainties. It's up to the planners to decide which of these they think is more realistic and what to do about it. But then how this gets into safety, like we talked about, was once you identify the hotspots, there's firms out there that you can team with that look at images of video and detect movement of different things, also fixed assets. And then they come up with risk analysis to say, this vehicle nearly crashed with that other vehicle, or this vehicle nearly crashed with that pedestrian, and there was something that intervened, they stopped walking, or they banged on their hood and they, whatever. But they basically do risk analysis so that you don't have to use only collision data, you can use near miss data, which I actually call near collision because it was an actual miss. And as a pedestrian, I like near collisions. I don't like near misses, which means I almost didn't get hit. So this is the combination of how we can use multiple different data sets and hotspot analysis, and then sometimes go out in the field, sometimes use video, whatever the case might be. But for a huge region, using StreetLight data is super beneficial to identify where should we spend our money going out in the field and investigating, and where's there an actual problem. And I think was mentioned before, sometimes we know what's going on, but it's nice to have data to support it. So it's not just conjecture, it's not just our personal opinion, because two people have conflicting personal opinions, but the data can show which one's most likely. So some conclusions that I have are, share your ideas. Sometimes StreetLight can do things you don't even know, but they can't help you if you don't ask. Clearly define what you're actually trying to accomplish. In-person meetings, on the phone, whatever it is, talk live. Sometimes we try to use email too much, And really all that does is cause frustration and misunderstanding and take more time. And especially when you're either doing it as an R&D project or StreetLight's doing it because they're nice. It's nice to use our time wisely. So meeting live is also a recommendation. So with that, I'm going to stop because then we can have food for thought either here or snacks or whatever.